ahead and open your Bibles to the book of Exodus, chapter 20. Exodus 20 is where we're going to be today. Verse 12, we're going to be looking at the fifth commandment. Exodus 20, verse 12, just one verse. Let me go ahead and read it for us, and then we will jump in. Exodus 20, verse 12. We have worked our way through the first four commandments, the command not to have any other gods besides the Lord, the command not to make any images of God, the commandment to not take the Lord's name in vain, and the commandment to remember the Sabbath. And today we make a turn into commands that are focused more horizontally as we look at the command to honor your father and mother. Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. This is God's word for us this morning. I don't know, as we've been moving through the 10 Commandments, if you've thought through what those commandments are, if any of those have made you tense up a little bit thinking about hearing them preach, or maybe there's even a sense of a dread that's kind of hung over you. I know I have had that feeling as I've been thinking about preaching on some of these commands that the Lord gave the people of Israel so long ago. And in particular, this commandment, I think, has given me more anxiety or dread or a feeling of weightiness than any of the others. And that's for a number of reasons. One, because some of you, I know, hearing this commandment, and maybe with all the trappings that you associate, with the images of family values and a moral majority, and you think back on your childhood or your bring up, and you just feel hypocrisy and pain, and you look at this and you think of happy housewives and dads who come home at 5 o'clock and beaver cleaver and everything like that, and you think that vision of life is exactly why someone like you can't really truly belong here. Because if Christianity is about honoring your parents and having this great relationship with them, then you, with the things you have gone through or the things that have been done to you, that automatically kind of excludes you. And even though God might kind of welcome you in, no one else ever fully will. And so this commandment just reeks to you of a life that you cannot have, that is beyond your control. But that fails to acknowledge the other reality that makes me anxious to preach this commandment. It's that nearly every pastoral situation I find myself in, almost every conversation I have, every counseling session, every story, every family in this church has some level of brokenness or pain or tension or disappointment or hurt in one direction or the other between generations. There's pain with parents who feel like their children have betrayed them, hurt them, abandoned them, aggrieved them, insulted them. And if you think I'm speaking of you in particular, no, I'm not. And then the other way, children who on a wide spectrum feel like their parents are anything but honorable. So how can the Lord expect them to exercise obedience to this command? This command is difficult for us to navigate. And yet, the Lord in his wisdom put it right in the center of the 10 Commandments. So today, just want to frame this up a little bit about what we're going to explore this morning. First, I'm going to focus on the big picture today. We're going to make some broad applications, some broad observations on this text, and I'm probably not going to address all the details of your particular circumstance. But what I would encourage you to do with this is let the public ministry of the word, as I'm standing up here and talking to all of you, let that kind of push you toward private ministry of the word. Come and speak with me or JC or David or Jimmy or someone who's in your home group and say, I want to figure out how to work through this. And let me just kind of share the particularities of my life so that you can help me through the word be obedient and by God's grace. And second, the thing I would just want to frame this as we begin is we say here at Woodfields that we exist to bring all walks of life into one family of grace. We believe that we are a family together. And we belong in this family not because we have succeeded at being so great in our family that our families then said, you would go be a blessing to that family too. We belong here purely by the grace of God. And all of us are sinners and sufferers in need of the care of Jesus. So as we consider what this command has to say to us, the thing we need to keep at the forefront of our minds is, what is this command ultimately showing us about the God who commands us to pray, our Father in heaven? And how do we act in light of that? So we're going to look at this command kind of in four different directions, or four perspectives on this command. First, narrowly, we're going to look just directly at this command, think about what it has to say about our relationships between parents and children. Second, we're going to look at more broadly, what does that mean for us, and how do we think about the wider world around us? Then we're going to look at it honestly, just kind of acknowledging some of the pain and the difficulties associated with that. And then finally, we're going to look at this hopefully. Think about, why is this commandment ultimately good news for us? That's how we're going to go. Narrowly, broadly, honestly, hopefully. Let's go ahead and jump in. Let's look at this commandment narrowly. Let me read it again for us. Verse 12, Exodus 20. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Remember what we're doing with the Ten Commandments here. Remember how we're seeing these commandments working. What they're doing is they're kind of painting this moral landscape for us to live in. So if I go on vacation, I go out and I see the Rockies or the Grand Canyon, and you say, well, what was it like? And I say, well, there was sky and then there were mountains and rocks. That doesn't really help you put yourself there or imagine what that is like. But if I can pull out a painting I'd made, or a picture that I took, I can hold it in front of you. That can give you an idea of where what it would be like for you yourself to stand there. The Ten Commandments are kind of doing that. We know that the two great commandments that Jesus gives us are to love God and to love our neighbor. But that's kind of just like saying there are skies and there are mountains. We're now saying, well, how do we fill that out? What should we put in that landscape? And the first four commandments that we looked at have been exploring, what does it mean for us to love God? What's the shape of a life that loves God? What does that look like? And now this is kind of moving. It doesn't leave behind loving God, but it takes on this other dimension. What does it mean to love our neighbor? And the first commandment that we're given is this command: honor your father and mother. It's the second commandment of only two to be stated positively. Notice that it doesn't say don't dishonor. It says honor. The only other commandment that's like that is the Sabbath command that we looked at a couple weeks ago. That one didn't say don't forget the Sabbath. It said specifically remember the Sabbath. I think the idea there is that it's not just that we're supposed to figure out what are all the ways that this could possibly be broken, but we're supposed to be thinking positively, what are all the ways we could be obedient to this? It kind of pushes us in a slightly different direction. And the first relationship that God is setting up for us to consider, as he's going to be moving in to talk about how we relate with those we're in conflict with, how we relate to our spouses, how we relate to other people's possessions, how we relate to those who have had things spoken against them. The most fundamental relationship, the first thing that God wants us to deal with here, is how children of all ages relate to parents. The commandment that ties together the relationship between God and neighbor is this one: honor your father and mother. Now, why would that be? Let's think about what a parent is. Parents are simultaneously our introduction, our first exposure, one, to other human relationships, and two, to figures of authority. The first person that you're ever in any kind of direct relationship with is your mother. Before you even enter the world, you're already dependent upon her for life, for existing, for continuing to have blood going through your body that is not able to sustain itself. The first relationship that you have is with the person who gives birth to you. And then even after that, when you are a little baby and you can't even see more than 6 inches in front of your face, you have a older human being caring, cleaning, feeding, sustaining you. And that way, parents, they're the first picture of grace that any of us receive. We have done nothing to earn this relationship except to be born. And yet parents, just by nature of being parents, keep us alive, feed us, clothe us, make us who we are, for better or for worse. We are fundamentally indebted creatures. By the time you learn to tie your shoes, you have already been saved thousands of deaths because you've been fed and kept warm and kept safe over and over and over and over again. You will never fully be your own person. For better or for worse, the people who raised you helped shape you to be who you are. And God has so created us that this relationship is fundamental to who we are as human beings. You know, like Cabbage Patch Kids aren't really a thing, right? You can't just plant a bunch of kids and they kind of pop up in the field by themselves. We're inherently tied to other people. And so our honoring of our parents, our acknowledging this reality, whatever that means, whatever shape that takes, it's the visible representation. It's the way you're demonstrating that you understand the world you exist in. You're demonstrating that you understand that you live in a world that exists purely by grace. Not fundamentally, and first the grace of your parents or your caretaker, the one who raised you, but by the grace of God. Because the closest analog that a small child can get to a benevolent creator, sustainer, protector is a parent. The closest thing that we have in our lives to understanding what is God like toward us is a parent who watches after his children, which is why God compels us to identify him as Father. So this commandment is about much more than just saying yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, or just cleaning up your toys. It's about how do we fit into the world that we have been born into. And then that helps us, if we kind of keep that in mind, it helps us understand the severity of this command when it is violated elsewhere. You'll read passages, we'll get to them later on in the book of Exodus, where we're going to see that this commandment is among of only a few other commandments whose penalty, if it's violated, is death. Exodus 21, verse 15, whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Verse 17, whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. And if you think that that's just some Old Testament ridiculous, over-the-top statement, even though the death penalty is not carried into the New Testament, you still read this. And in Romans 1, when Paul is summarizing the way in which we have wandered from God, it says, in verse 28, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil. All of that sounds pretty bad, right? And then it says, disobedient to parents. Directly in the middle of Paul's seeing what is ultimately wrong with the world is that there's this breakdown between these relationships. Later on in 1 Timothy 5, Paul's going to be speaking about widows who need to be cared for. And he says, first, make sure that they have no family around to take care of them before the church steps in to be involved, because if you actually take that from them, you're taking away one of their core responsibilities. And it says, he who fails to care for his family is worse than an unbeliever. One who claims to be a follower of the Lord and yet fails to care for his parents is worse than an unbeliever. Why? Because what this command is ultimately pointing us toward is how we relate to our parents is a very good indication of how will we relate to our God. So what does it mean then to honor? What does it mean to honor your parents? Let's just kind of think about this word a little bit, just briefly to kind of frame up a big idea for us. First, this word, it only gets used a few other places in the book of Exodus, and it's always used by the Lord to talk about what the Lord is going to do to his own name. So, for example, when he's telling Moses that he's going to judge Egypt, he says, I am going to honor my name, or I am going to glorify my name. I'm going to give glory to my name. That's the same word that's used here that's translated honor. To honor or to give glory to or to glorify, we are to do that both to the Lord and also to our parents. So the Lord uses it to describe the result of his work for the people of Israel. He's going to work in their midst, and then they're going to glorify his name. So what does that mean for us? How does that relate to our parents? At base level, what that carries with it is this idea that we are to recognize the work of grace that's been exercised on your behalf. If you exist, there is grace in your life. Even if you never saw your parents after the second you entered the world, the fact that you entered the world is a testimony to the fact that there has been grace bestowed upon you. And secondly, this word glory, this word honor, it carries this idea of weightiness. This idea of a heaviness, of a seriousness, of a sobriety. What we've said already here shows us that the idea of the office or the role of a parent, it is a crucial one. It is essential to our well-being. And if it really is supposed to be a picture to children of what God is like, that is something that we ought not to take lightly. And what that means is that your parents, your fathers and mothers, for good or for bad, they will give an account. They will answer to the Lord for how they represented him to you. And you, as a parent, will give the same account to the Lord for how you represented the Lord to your children. And what that ought to do before anything else is give us pause. That should cause us to feel the weight of this reality. Your parents will give an account. You as a parent will give an account. That is a weighty task to take on for yourself. Who wants to be held responsible for accurately demonstrating the mercy and the kindness and the graciousness of the Lord? Who is sufficient for that? So what does that mean for us then? As a child, I think the first and the most basic way that we can think about what does this look like for us in our relationships. Say you exercise mercy. One thing I'm realizing as I'm entering into parenthood is that when I was my daughter's age or a little bit older, I thought my parents had everything figured out. I thought they were like experts at the parent thing, that like you read a book and you were good to go. I'm realizing I know nothing. And so that means I feel like I might begin figuring things out like 10, 15, 20 years from now. And that's like well after like they had their shot, right? You know, they're figuring it out on the fly. We have to exercise mercy. Judge as you want to be judged. The basic commandments that we're called to exercise toward all. When Jesus says, take the log out of your own eye before you remove the speck in another. Exercise mercy. Judge as you want to be judged. And then, particularly as we see our parents age, grow old, grow weak, provide care as you can. Tend to their well-being. Show them the honor that they have bestowed upon you. And second, for parents, recognize what you are called to represent. You're called to much more than making sure that your kids are well-fed and washed and behaving. You're called to much more than just simply making sure that your kids get to school on time, that they have a good GPA, and that they get to college. You are called to show what God is like to them. The goal of your parenting should be that if a stranger were to walk up to your child and say, what is the God that you worship like? They'd be able to say, you know, it looks a lot like that. And they point at you. That is heavy. So recognize what you're called to represent. Give yourself over to thinking about the mercy and the kindness and the gratitude and the discipline of the Lord, and then repent where you fall short and strive for holiness by God's grace. Because these are serious relationships that we find ourselves in. And the people that we relate so closely to, they have a great task in front of them. And it's with that sense of weightiness, that sense, you could even use the word reverence, that we can begin to understand not just our relationships with one another directly between parents and children, but we can begin to think about all of our relationships more clearly. So that brings us to our second point. One, we've considered what it means narrowly. What does this commandment look like? Two, I want us to think about what does this commandment mean kind of more broadly. When we think about family, usually we think of kind of the one little household, right? Mom, dad, 2.5 kids, dog, right? That kind of image in our mind, the picket fence, and that is what a family is to us. But in the Bible, family means much more than an immediate nuclear household. We've already seen this within the book of Exodus when Israel's called again and again and again the sons of Israel, and Israel was an individual. He was Jacob, the one who had all these children, right? But this is hundreds of years later after that, and yet they're all being called the sons of this one man. Family extends for generations into this much wider system. We're going to see as we continue to walk through Exodus that involves tribes and clans and generations, that it expands wide out into the world. And not only does does the word family mean much more than immediate nuclear household, we also see that the words father and mother are used throughout scriptures to mean much more than your biological parents. JC mentioned in our confession insurance that this idea of a spiritual father or a spiritual mother, this comes from Paul talking about that you've had many gods, but you have not had many fathers. He talks about himself ministering to the Thessalonians. He says, I was like a compassionate father towards you. I was like a gracious mother. You also see language used of talking about the people who invented things or accomplished great things. They'll say they were the father of all those who did this or all those who do this. They all kind of owe their ultimate origin to the original. And so this image of fathering and mothering kind of expands into the wider world. And what that ultimately teaches us is we live in a world designed, built into its DNA, at its core, one with authority and submission, one with hierarchy and organization, one in which God has created. He reigns over all things, and then he places people, families, parents, fathers, mothers, emperors, senators, governors, parents, children, all into this system that showcases ultimately that we all answer to someone higher than ourselves. And that is not a bad thing. The ideal creation is not one in which everything just disappears and we're all exactly the same. But we live in a world in which we were created to relate to others and to give them due respect for the place in which they have been placed. We're to approach the world realizing that others relate to us in different ways. Just as you don't choose your parents, you don't choose your nationality, your economic background, or your heritage. Those decisions, for better or for worse, were made long before you had a say in them. You don't get to choose where you're born. You don't get to choose who you are born to. You don't get to choose the history of the country in which we live. Other things have been done on our behalf either justly or unjustly, that have put us in our current position, and we must recognize that. It would be unbiblical for us not to acknowledge that truth. We don't just all enter into the world with the same set of stuff and then we kind of make our own way. We step into histories that have been unfolding. And other people occupy positions of authority that you never will. I don't think anyone in this room will ever be president of the United States. Probably never a senator. Probably not even ever a state senator. There are those of us in here who will never be pastors. There are those in here who will never be grandparents. There are those of us in here who will never be any number of things. And that is all part of God's good design. You will give an account for the particular place that you have been put, both in the way in which you exercise that role and also the way in which you obey those above you. The way in which you recognize the tasks others have been given. That's why the New Testament can be full of commands where he'll talk to Timothy or Titus and say, you should relate to all older men as fathers, as all older women as mothers. You should relate to the younger men as brothers and to the young women as sisters. Or when Peter is writing to a church that is being persecuted, that is suffering, he sees this storm cloud forming on the horizon where the emperor, this godless pagan persecutor, is rising up. He's able to say, be subject, 1 Peter 2:13, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil. Verse 17, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Honor the emperor? Why? He's killing us because he'll give account, and you don't want to be in his shoes. And what this ultimately teaches us, if God has organized the world in this way, that we enter the world fundamentally dependent upon other decisions, other people, make one that teaches us that we are completely dependent upon the grace of God, both for good. Every good thing we have received is by the grace of God. And when we step into systems that are broken, that we find ourselves benefiting from wrongs or evils that have been done in the past, we are dependent upon His grace for that as well. And if this is the case, if the world is designed in this way, and if the way in which we respect others is supposed to give us an idea of how we are to relate to God, then it only makes sense that these relationships are so targeted in the world we live in from day one of fallen humanity. We have been subverting authority. We decided to listen to a snake instead of the creator of all things. And that broke the entire system. So what does that look like for us? What's that look like in our culture today? One, this impulse that you need to be your own person, completely divided from anyone else that has ever come before you. What is that saying ultimately? What it's trying to communicate, if we're looking at it positively, is that you need to be responsible for yourself. You need to make something. You need to not blame everyone else for your problems, which is good. But what that runs the risk of doing is ignoring the fact that if you have been through things, if you just push that stuff beneath you and say, I'm just not going to be defined by that, that stuff will rot away from the inside. And you have to deal with it. Another way that this works as well is that all relationships now, in almost every sphere of life, they've been reduced to just this level of this kind of contractual transaction with one another. Everything is defined in terms of what can you give me, what are the terms of agreement here, and it's a complete removal of any concept of which we simply give unto others because we are gracious and good. If that's the way that you're going to relate to your children, you are not going to have a good relationship with them. I have done this for you, so you owe this to me. That's not how it works. And another way in which this works itself out is just this booming language that we find around us of everything being toxic or harmful or dangerous or against us. Sometimes things are that bad. Sometimes relationships are so broken that the best thing for you to do is to remove yourself from it. But we cannot use that label for everything that's merely inconvenient. Just because a relationship asks or demands something of you, demands your patience, demands your time, demands your sacrifice, that does not mean that it's bad. But simply acknowledges the reality we live in a world that is not as it ought to be. The people that ultimately teach you about the Lord are sinners. They are broken. They have their own pains as well. Which brings us to our third point this morning. Consider what it means narrowly, consider what it means broadly. Now I want us to consider what this means for us honestly. Because for many of us, those preceding difficulties, these breakdowns in these relationships, that sounds more like reality than the picture that we gave at the beginning of this relationship that just happens to magically teach you about God and show you everything that's great and wonderful about who God is. More of us feel much closer to the other side of the spectrum. Sadly, those who first show us what God is like are also the first people to show us what sinners are like. The first person to sin against you is going to be your parent. And you are going to be the first person to sin against your children. And if we do not recognize that, then we run the risk of completely glossing over what this commandment calls us to do. So what are we ultimately supposed to do when our parents, our fathers and mothers who we're called to honor, sin? And realize again, we're not going to be able to address everything. There's a wide spectrum. There's the basic inconvenience down to the downright abusive and violent and sinful. We can't speak to all of that here, but I just want to give a couple things for us to think about. One, to honor your father or your mother is to recognize their role, their office. It's to recognize the place that they've been put in. And what that means is part of honoring one who abuses or hurts or damages is to remove their ability to do that to you. To take the steps necessary so that you are safe and they cannot desecrate that role anymore. So part of honoring an abusive parent is to call for justice, to seek safety so that they may not further damage you or themselves. And secondly, I think we can find an analogy with that passage I read just a minute in 1 Peter, to the call to honor the emperor. Was this man a good man? No. Was he a righteous man? No. Was he doing things that were honorable? No. And yet, we're told to honor, told to recognize the position they hold. So for children, those of you who are looking at this commandment and just simply saying, I don't know how to begin, I'm just going to give you just two places for you to start. One, just grieve the pain that you've been through. Acknowledge the reality of what has happened to you. Realize that what you have experienced is not normal. It is not good. And grieve that before the Lord. Psalm 34, it says that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted. He cares for the afflicted. So grieve your pain and then guard your heart. Refuse to allow the things that have been done to you to create bitterness, anger, malice within yourself. For parents, recognize that your calling is not to earn your children's affection. It's not to earn a place in your children's good graces. It's not to demand that your children return what you feel you deserve. Your calling is to lavish grace, even if that grace is squandered, even if that grace is wasted. If your children dishonor you, they will give an account to the Lord. And that will be more than enough punishment. And so you should feel that weight as well. And then for all of us, on either side of this relationship, even if honoring your parents is possible, if you make the right necessary steps, it's not like suddenly everything's going to be better. It's not like you can go home today and say and call up your parent that you've been estranged from, or the child you've had difficulty with, and say, you know what, I've realized I need to honor my father and mother. I've realized I haven't been honorable. Will you forgive me? And then everything's just going to be fine. Repair takes time. If a relationship has slowly been broken over 20 years, it's going to take that long to fix it. And reconciliation doesn't remove scars. Things that happen to us, they do not just simply go away. And that's just the reality we have to live with until the Lord returns and wipes all tears away from our eyes. But what we need to remind ourselves of, the thing we need to keep in mind, is that the Lord has been involved with broken families from the dawn of time. The first family that the Lord created, the husband and the wife ended being at each other's throats, blaming each other for the things that have happened. The son killed the other. And yet through broken families, the Lord brought about his son into our lives. The gospel is the story of God reclaiming a lost son. One of the Lord's favorite images to use of his relationship to his people is one of an abandoned orphan tossed to the side of the street, wallowing in its own blood. And he comes, he restores, he lifts up, he makes clean, he sets it in a place of honor. That is what we are. We were the orphan, we were the discarded, we were the rejected. But God in his mercy reached out and brought us home. He restored us into fellowship with him, despite the things we have done, despite the ways in which we have run away, despite the ways in which we have sinned against him. His grace was more than sufficient for us. God worked through broken families to bring his perfectly obedient son into the world. Jesus was perfectly obedient to his heavenly Father and to his parents. In Luke 2, it actually goes and it says, Jesus grew up and he was submissive to his parents. Jesus submitted to sinners. I mean, imagine being Mary. Imagine being Joseph, and you snap at the kid and you think a lightning bolt's going to take you out. And yet he's not only abundantly submissive, he's abundantly gracious and supportive and kind. And the great irony with this text, we haven't spent much time, but look at verse 12 again. It says that your days may be long in the land that your God is giving you. This promise is given that if you are obedient unto your parents, you are obedient unto me, and I will be faithful in the promises I have given you. Jesus was perfectly obedient, and he was cut off from the land. Jesus was crucified having been obedient to his Father. Jesus was put to death because he honored his Father above all things so that we could be forgiven, so that we can be adopted by a Father who will never leave, forsake, crush, or abandon us. Jesus' obedience to this commandment is what makes our disobedience possible to forgive. And in the grace of God, we are welcomed into a new family, a family of God. The gospel creates a family of grace, what we get to partake of now. And when we relate to one another, as God calls us to, when we recognize that we've been brought together by the blood of Jesus, our brother, into the presence of God, our Father, then we can begin to understand, what does it mean for us to live this way? To bestow honor is not, first and foremost, to give what others deserve. To bestow honor upon another human being is to exercise grace on their behalf. And the only way in which we come to understand that grace is by receiving the grace of God ourselves, and it, through Jesus, is offered to you. So as we close this morning, I want you to consider where you're at. Where are you at in your relationship with your family, with your children, with your parents, with all the pain, all the brokenness, all the difficulties that exist? I'm not saying that those are irrelevant or that those need to be dismissed or that you're just obviously the person in the wrong and you need to fix everything. What I'm asking you to acknowledge is simply acknowledge before the Lord, Lord, this is hard. And I need grace. And as you do so, receive the grace that's available in Jesus only. Consider what he's offered you. So I'm going to pray in just a moment. I ask you to pray that along with me. And if that's something that you need to talk about more, if that's something that you need to explore, you need help unpacking, that is why we are here to care for you as pastors. But let us realize that however greatly others have failed us, our Father never will. And he'll hold us fast.